air was soft and heavy with the fading light, and the small room seemed to hold its breath as shadows stretched long across the cracked floor where time itself seemed to linger in silence, broken only by the faint hum of crickets and the fluttering curtain that danced with the gentlest breeze from the open window. The scent of cardamom tea lingered, a reminder of warmth in the coolness of twilight, and in that space sat the grandmother, her body curved by the weight of years, her hands folded in her lap, hands marked by stories too vast for words, hands that had kneaded dough, lifted pails of water from deep stone wells, stitched torn fabric and torn skin, and held but the first cries of her children in the stillness of the day. Her hair, silver and thin, framed a face etched with lines that were less wrinkles than rivers of memory carved by decades of labor and love, grief and survival. At her feet sat her grandson, only 7, but already carrying the solemn curiosity of someone who sensed the fragility of moments like this. In his dark eyes, wide and steady, fixed on her as though searching for something buried in her silence. "But tell me a story," he whispered, his voice breaking the air as delicately as a bird's wing, and she smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with a knowing tenderness, telling him that stories are not always light, that some carry weight, some end in silence, and some are too heavy for ears so young. But the boy, stubborn in the way of the innocent who believe their hearts stronger than their years, pressed closer and promised her that he could listen, not only with his ears, but with the whole of himself. Slowly, carefully, as though testing whether the words would hold or falter, she reached for his hand, her fingers trembling, her skin papery and soft, and as the warmth of his small palm met hers, she felt a bridge being built across the gulf of generations, one fading into dusk, one only just rising with the dawn. She let out a breath that seemed to carry years of silence, and when she spoke, her voice was fragile but steady, like smoke rising from embers long after the fire has burned, telling him she too had once been younger than he was now, a barefoot girl running wild through golden fields, her braids trailing behind her, her laughter quick and bright, the world then still vast and full of promise. But her childhood had lasted, she said, her words pressing heavy against the walls of the room. For soldiers had come one morning with boots that shook the earth, with rifles that gleamed in the sun, and with voices sharp and cruel. And they had taken her father because he had dared to speak truth where silence was demanded. She remembered the moment clearly even now, the way the dust rose as he was dragged away, the way his eyes met hers one last time as if to pass on strength he could not leave in any other way, and how her mother had collapsed on the earth as the door slammed shut. Her tears flowing until they dried into an emptiness no child could repair. She told the boy that she never saw her father again, that she learned at 7 what some never learn in a lifetime. The world does not wait for you to grow. It forces you, and sometimes it steals what you love most without reason. By 10, she had become more mother than child, cooking when she barely knew how, carrying jars of water almost heavier than herself, mending clothes with clumsy stitches, her laughter buried deep beneath the weight of survival. She looked down at her grandson then, her lips quivering as she confessed she sometimes forgot what it was to be young because her childhood had been stolen before she could finish it. And the boy tightened his hand around hers as if to give back to her the piece of childhood she had lost, and for a brief moment she felt that maybe, through his listening, her stolen years were finally being given back in the form of remembrance, to the form of remembrance. As the last of the lights slipped away beyond the horizon and the room was left with a quiet glow of two souls bound together in the fragile space between past and future, her voice carried on in the dimming room, soft but resolute, the kind of voice that had learned to survive its own trembling. And she told the boy that even in the darkest seasons of life there are moments when the heart dares to bloom and fur. That bloom came in the form of a boy with storm-colored eyes who appeared one day at the well, where she struggled to lift a clay pot too heavy for her thin arms. And without a word he took the other side, steadying it with quiet strength, and though she bristled, insisting she could manage. He smiled with a patience that disarmed her, and from that day on she noticed him wherever life placed her, whether in the market where he lingered by the grain stalls or on the dusty road where his shadow fell nearer, until his presence itself became a comfort. Their love did not arrive with declarations or gifts of wealth. It grew like wildflowers pushing through cracks in stone, small gestures quietly sewn into the fabric of survival, a fig left by the well, a patch sewn into a torn shawl, glance that lingered longer than it should have, and in these small acts she found refuge, a reminder that even in times of hunger and fear, tenderness could take root. But the world has a way of testing fragile joys, and before long war returned as it always did, like a storm repeating itself across generations, and the boy she loved was taken from her and drafted into battles that were never theirs to fight, leaving her once again with a silence heavy enough to drown in. For months she lived in dread, her nights haunted by the thought of him lying broken on a field she could not reach, her days filled with the ache of waiting. Yet still she clung to hope, because love is sometimes no more than the stubborn refusal to give despair the final word. When he finally returned, he was alive, but altered, his once straight shoulders bent under invisible weight, his laughter gone, his eyes shadowed by things he would never speak of. Yet she loved him not less but more, because she understood that love is not only for moments of joy, but also for the wounds that joy cannot heal. They married without gold, without feasts or music, surrounded only by family who understood that vows whispered in the quiet could be louder than any celebration. And in that union they promised to stand together no matter what storms would come. And storms did come, not only in the form of war, but in the relentless grind of hunger and need, for the land they worked was stubborn, and harvests often failed, leaving too little food for too many mouths. She told the boy how she would sometimes pretend to be full, pushing aside her own hunger so that her children could eat, filling her belly with water and prayer, her body trembling with weakness, but her spirit refusing to yield. And though her husband worked beside her, carrying the same burdens, there were nights when silence stretched between them like an unspoken grief, yet even in those silences their bond was unbroken. Then her voice faltered as she spoke of the cruelest wound of all, the loss of her child, a son not much younger than the boy before her, whose body had burned with fever until even her lullabies could no longer reach him, and she remembered the stillness of holding him after his last breath. The unbearable task of digging the earth with her own hands, lowering him into it wrapped in the cloth she had woven, singing a song not for sleep but for farewell. Her grandson's eyes filled with tears as he pressed closer, and she stroked his hair with fingers that trembled from memory, telling him then she did not break, for mothers are not given the luxury of surrender. And she rose again the next morning, her body whole with grief, but her hands steady, cooking, cleaning, working, because the others still needed her, because life, cruel as it was, demanded to be lived. She told him love is not a shield that prevents pain. It is a fire that allows one to keep moving through it. And in that fire she had walked every day of her life, carrying both joy and loss in the same breath, her voice now carrying the weight of decades, but still burning with the truth that what remains after loss is not only sorrow, but the fierce reminder that to have loved at all is to have lived full. Her voice grew slower now, heavier, as though every word carried the weight of years lived through storms. And she told the boy that marriage was never only about love, but about the brutal work of survival, the kind that stripped away illusions and left only what was necessary. Because when his grandfather returned from the war, he was alive in body but fractured in spirit, his laughter dimmed, his step uneven, and yet he worked beside her, bending his scarred hands into the stubborn soil that seemed too weary to give. And together they tried to coax life from the earth that war had left wounded, each harvest a question of whether there would be enough to keep the children alive. She said that with every child born, joy and fear arrived in the same breath, for each small cry was both a miracle and another mouth to feed, another fragile body to shield from hunger. And she painted for him the memory of nights when she stirred thin porridge in a cracked pot. 'Cause it's an ant. Her children watching with eyes far too hollow for their years, waiting for a bowl that was never full enough, and she told him how she would smile, pretend to eat, and then leave her own portion untouched, filling her belly with water so that they might believe she too was satisfied, teaching herself to quiet the gnawing ache inside with prayer, with determination, with the knowledge that to complain was a luxury the poor could not afford. The boy listened, his small hand gripping hers tighter, and she went on, telling him that neighbors sometimes shared what little they had, but often there was nothing to give, for suffering had visited every home, and hunger was like a shadow sitting at every table, watching silently, never satisfied. Then her voice dropped lower, fragile, and she told him of the sickness that came like a thief in the night, stealing one of her youngest sons when he was barely more than a toddler, his body feverish, his breath shallow, and with no doctor, no medicine, no money. She had nothing to offer but her arms, her voice, her love, so she sang lullabies into the still night, begging the child to stay, as though her voice alone could hold him, tethered to the earth, but death does not bargain, and one evening his tiny chest stilled against her, leaving her with silence so cruel that even her heartbeat felt like a betrayal. She described the burial with words that trembled but did not break, how she dug the ground with her own blistered hands because there was no one to pay for a grave digger, how she wrapped him in a cloth she had woven, lowering him gently into the earth as if she were laying him down for sleep, and how she walked back to the sound of her other children crying for food, the ache of grief colliding with the demands of the living, for even sorrow had no room in a house where hunger still ruled. The boy's tears spilled freely then, and he pressed his face against her lap, whispering that he wished he could have helped her, and she stroked his hair with a trembling hand, whispering back that he was simply by listening, simply by carrying her story in his small and tender heart. She told him that after that day something inside her hardened, not in cruelty but in resolve, for she had learned that the world would not stop its cruelty on her behalf, that the only shield she had was her love for her children, and that love was enough to turn her into stone when storms came, enough to keep her feet moving when her body begged to collapse, enough to make her rise before dawn to work until her bones screamed, so that her children might endure too. Her voice, though frail, gathered strength as she explained that love is not the soft thing people imagine. It is not always laughter and comfort. Sometimes it is a shield. Sometimes it is the fire that burns inside a mother's chest, refusing to die out even when the winds of despair blow fiercest. And she pressed her thin hand over her heart, telling him that every beat was proof that love had carried her when strength alone would have failed. The boy looked up at her, his eyes wide with awe, whispering that she had been so brave, and she smiled, shaking her head, telling him that bravery had nothing to do with it. She was simply a mother, and mothers do not have the choice to give. They only move forward because behind them are the faces of children who need them, who depend on them, and if she had fallen, they would have fallen too. For a moment the room was still, the quiet pierced only by the song of crickets beyond the window, and she stroked his hair in slow circles, soothing him as much as the ghost of her own memory, reminding him softly that she did not tell these stories to weigh him down, but to show him that strength is born from suffering, that hope can live in the smallest ember even when the fire is nearly gone out, and that one day when his own storms come, he must remember that despair is never the final word, because as long as love remains, survival is always possible. A voice softened then, like the hush of dawn after a storm, and she told the boy that even in the hardest seasons, when hunger gnawed at their bellies and grief sat at the edge of every bed, she learned that hope must be planted like a seed, tended in silence, guarded with patience. And though there were days she doubted the soil of her life could grow anything but sorrow, she discovered that even barren ground can yield if one keeps returning with faith. And so she began each day, not with tears, but with small acts of persistence seemed almost invisible. Rising before the sun to draw water, to mend clothes, to gather firewood, to plant what little grain she could save from the mouths of her children. And she whispered to herself that survival was not only about enduring, but about preparing, about trusting that tomorrow might hold more than today. And in this quiet defiance she found strength. She told the boy that she looked at her children and refused to let their eyes be filled only with the shadow of despair. So she made up stories at night, tales of rivers that never dried, of fields that bent under the weight of golden wheat, of homes where laughter drowned out the cries of hunger. And though the children knew these were dreams, their eyes still lit with wonder, and in that light she saw the fragile beginnings of resilience. She explained that seeds of hope are not always planted in fields. Sometimes they are planted in hearts, in words spoken gently, in lullabies sung against the silence of grief, in the simple act of believing that what is broken can one day be mended. She spoke of how she saved a handful of beans one year, even though her children begged to eat them, how she buried them in the soil instead of in their bellies, whispering to the earth as she covered them that she was planting tomorrow itself. And though the children wept in night, when the stalks finally pushed through the ground weeks later, when green life appeared where once there was only dust, they all understood that patience and sacrifice could turn emptiness into abundance. The boy's eyes widened as she spoke, as if he could see the fragile shoots rising from the soil, and she told him that this is what hope is. A choice made in the darkest hour, a refusal to let despair devour everything. She remembered the moments when her husband, weary from his own battles, would look at the small patch of green and smile, and how that smile itself was another seed, proof that even broken men could believe again when given a reason. And she told the boy that children too became her seeds of hope. For though she carried them through suffering, they also carried her, their laughter in fleeting moments like sunlight breaking through clouds, their small hands reaching for hers, reminding her that love, even when surrounded, push a body forward. She leaned closer, her voice trembling yet resolute, saying that she began to see hope not as a distant miracle, but as something cultivated daily, a habit, a discipline, the steady turning of despair into determination. And she reminded him that life will always try to convince you that nothing will change, that storms will never pass. But if you dare to plant something in that soil, an action, a dream, a belief, you may one day look back and see that the barren ground was not empty, but waiting. The boy's face glowed in the faint light of the lamp, and she smiled faintly, telling him that hope does not erase pain. It does not fill the belly or bring back the dead, but it gives strength to rise, to plant to give strength to rise, to plant again, to sing again, to love again. And sometimes that is enough to carry a life forward. And she pressed his hand into hers, whispering that he must learn to plant seeds in his own heart, to guard them from the winds of despair, to water them with kindness and patience, for one day he too would need them if he carried her story. Then her seeds of hope would not end with with her, but bloomed through him and through the children who would one day sit at his feet and ask for the same story. Her words slowed like the fading embers of a fire, her breath shallow yet steady, and she told the boy that as the years passed, the body grew weary, though the spirit still clung to its duty. And she learned to recognize the signs of endings, the way twilight falls longer, the way silence stretches heavier, the way the bones whisper of journeys almost complete. And she admitted there were nights when she lay awake, listening to the rhythm of her own heart, wondering how many more dawns she would greet. Yet instead of fear, she felt a strange calm, as if life itself was a circle drawing toward its close, and she wanted the boy to understand that death is not only loss, also really loss, but also release, like a lantern carried down a dark path until the flame is passed into other hands. She recalled the faces of those she had buried, her parents, her husband, a child too small to remember, and she said that grief had carved valleys, light and those valleys light had also rusted, because every life gone left behind a teaching. Every absence made her cling harder to the presence that remained, and as her hair turned silver and her steps slowed, she realized the greatest gift was not in what she had lost, or even what she had endured, but in what she could hand down, the fragments of story, the lessons won through pain, the quiet courage of survival itself. The boy pressed against her side, eyes wet, whispering that he did not want her to leave, and she brushed her fingers through his hair, assuring him that though her body would one day falter, she would not vanish. For people do not disappear when their names are spoken, when their stories are carried, when their love is remembered, and she promised him that every time he told her tales, every time he planted kindness in the world, every time he held on to hope even in darkness, she would be there, alive in his memory, alive in his choices, alive in the quiet inheritance of love. She described how light works at sunset, how it seems to retreat, but really it scatters, glowing across the sky, turning into colors the eye cannot hold. And she told him that this was what she would become, scattering a memory woven into the dusk, a flame that might fade from sight but not from warmth. Her hand trembled as she lifted it, placing it gently over his heart, saying that the stories she poured into him were not meant to weigh him down, but to guide him, to remind him that survival is never just about breath, but about meaning, that love outlasts the body, that endurance outlasts despair, and that when she was gone he must carry this light as his own, shielding it when storms came, feeding it when the winds tried to smother it, for one day it would be his turn to pass it forward. The boy nodded fiercely, as if already vowing to keep her alive inside him, and she smiled faintly, her eyes soft with both sorrow and peace, telling him that endings are not meant to frighten, but to remind us of the treasure of every moment, that the cup of life is never endless, and so every drop must be tasted. And she urged him to look at the world not with the bitterness of what cannot be changed, but with the tenderness of what still can. Because though her own journey was drawing near its horizon, his had barely begun. His had barely begun. And she believed in him with the weight of all her years. The room grew quieter then, the dim light turning golden across her wrinkled face. And she said that when the final light comes, it does not demand sadness alone. It asks for gratitude, gratitude for the day survived, for the children raised, for the laughter and tears, for the love that had been given and received. And she confessed that if she could do it all again, even the hunger, the losses, the nights of despair, she would, because within it all lived the unbreakable thread of love that bound her to those she cherished and clung, who now sat as the keeper of her flame. He buried his face in her lap, weeping softly, and she held him, not to protect him from grief, but to teach him that grief itself is another form of love, proof that what mattered was real. And she whispered that when the time came and her chair sat empty, He should not search for her in silence, but in the stories, in the echoes of her laughter, in the lessons of her survival, in the warmth of his own heart, because that was where her light would remain, flickering, guiding, eternal. Her voice now was little more than a whisper, yet it carried with it the weight of generations, and she told the boy that the greatest inheritance she had to give was not land, not gold, not treasures of the world, for she had none of those to offer, but something greater, something invisible yet unbreakable, the light that had carried her through hunger, war, grief, and love, a light passed down to her not through wealth, but through the stories of those who endured before her. And now it was his to guard, his to carry, his to scatter into the future. She told him that the inheritance of light is made of many things. The patience of his grandfather's callous hands working the soil even when the harvest failed. The courage of her own heart beating through loss that could have crushed her. The laughter of children who found joy even when their bellies were empty, and the quiet resilience of a people who refused to bow entirely to despair. And she explained that this inheritance cannot be measured in coins or counted in possessions, but is written in the choices he will make, in the kindness he will show, in the way he will rise when life tries to break him. She said to him that one day he too would sit where she sat, older, weaker, his hair perhaps silver like hers, and a younger soul would lean close, asking for stories, asking for truth, and when that day came, it would be his turn to pass the light to ensure that it did not end with. Because the flame of one life alone is fragile, but when passed forward it becomes a fire that no darkness can extinguish. She told him that he must remember always that the world will try to convince him that cruelty is stronger than compassion, dare is stronger than hope, that selfishness is wiser than sacrifice, but he must not believe those lies, because her life had proven otherwise. Her survival was proof that love, even wounded and weary, was always stronger. And she wanted him to carry this truth as armor against the storms he would surely face. The boy stared up at her, wide-eyed, as if absorbing every syllable into the marrow of his bones, and she smiled faintly, telling him that the inheritance of light was already inside him, that his very tears were proof he carried her love, that his listening heart was proof he carried her strength. And she urged him not to wait until he was grown to share it. She would live again, not as memory alone, but as action, as presence, as the invisible thread tying past a few. Her hand, frail and trembling, pressed once more against his chest, and she told him that within him beats not only his own heart, but the echo of hers, the echo of every ancestor who had endured, and with each beat the light grew stronger, waiting for the day he would pass it on. And she said softly that death was not an end, but a doorway, and through it the flame does not vanish, but spreads, and he must learn to see her not only in loss, but in every act of love, every seed of hope, every moment of survival he carries forward. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he whispered he would never forget, and she nodded, her eyes closing as though already drifting toward the horizon. Yet her lips curved into a smile, because she knew the light was safe. It was carried now in him. It would outlive her. It would grow beyond her reach. And as the lamp in the corner flickered, as night gathered outside the window, she whispered one final truth, that in the end, our lives are measured not by the weight of suffering or the tally of possessions, but by the light we kindle in others. And that light, once given, never truly dies. It only changes hands, it only grows, it only endures.